The quiet presence. The morning air was crisp, and the sun cast a gentle golden light across the quiet streets of Oakwood, a wealthy neighborhood known for its pristine gardens, luxury cars, and upscale boutiques. The sky was clear, not a cloud in sight, as the world seemed to bask in a rare, perfect day. The peace of the morning was only interrupted by the soft hum of activity in the heart of the district, particularly at B Bakery, a small but renowned establishment known for its elaborate cakes, pastries, and decadent desserts. It was a bakery that catered exclusively to the upper crust of society, where the wealthy gathered to indulge in the finest treats that money could buy. At 10:15 a.m., a figure appeared at the entrance of the bakery, a man in his late 70s, dressed in simple but clean khaki pants, a white shirt slightly worn with age, and well-maintained shoes that had seen many miles. He was George, a black man who had lived through decades of change and challenges, but whose quiet dignity was unmatched by his modest appearance. Despite his age and the simplicity of his attire, George's presence seemed to command the space in a way that made the bustling bakery momentarily pause. As George slowly entered the bakery, a soft bell rang, the faint sound echoing as the door closed behind him. The hum of chatter in the room faded for a split second as every eye in the establishment turned toward him. His arrival was not expected, and certainly not a sight that matched the polished, expensive aura of the place. The guests inside, well-dressed and adorned with expensive jewelry, stared at him with visible discomfort, their eyes narrowing in judgment. They whispered to each other, clearly unsure what to make of the elderly man standing in their midst. George ignored the stares. His back remained straight, and though he walked with a cane, his steps were steady, deliberate. There was a quiet grace in the way he carried himself, as though he had seen far too much of life to be fazed by the opinions of others. His smile, though soft, was warm, the kind of smile that spoke of years of wisdom and experiences that no one could take away. As he approached the counter, his eyes met those of the young woman behind it. Amanda, a 25-year-old saleswoman, stood tall and confident behind the counter. Her flawless features and immaculate uniform exuded an air of professionalism, but there was a hint of arrogance in the way she looked at George. She was used to dealing with wealthy clientele, used to the pristine and polished appearances that frequented the bakery, and George, in his humble attire, seemed an odd fit for the space. Her gaze shifted momentarily to her colleagues, other employees who were glancing over with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty, and then back to George. "Can I help you?" Amanda's voice was polite, but there was a subtle edge to her tone, a quiet condescension that belied her surface-level courtesy. She didn't expect this man to be one of the typical customers that walked through the door, those who always ordered the most expensive items and tipped lavishly. She assumed he was just a wanderer, perhaps lost, or someone who had no business being in such a place. George looked at her for a moment, his eyes never wavering from hers, before speaking. "Yes, I'd like to buy a cake," he said, his voice calm but firm. "A simple one, something modest. I don't need anything extravagant." Amanda, still unsure of how to treat him, blinked twice, processing his request. It wasn't the response she had expected. Most people who came in for cakes had their eyes set on the grand, multi-tiered confections that were designed to impress. They ordered with the expectation of something stunning, something that would demonstrate their wealth. But George, without asking for anything ornate, simply wanted a humble cake. It threw Amanda off, but she quickly recovered, attempting to mask her surprise with a cold professionalism. "Of course," she replied, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We have a variety of cakes. If you'd like to take a look at the options, I can help you choose." She gestured toward the display case, which showcased an array of extravagant desserts, each more elaborate than the last. Gold leaf decorations, sugar flowers, and delicate frosting designs adorned the cakes. Each one seemed more fit for a celebrity event than for a simple gathering. George nodded, stepping closer to the display case, his hands resting lightly on his cane. He scanned the offerings, his eyes passing over the lavish creations without a second glance. His mind wasn't on grandeur or decoration. Instead, he was looking for something else, a cake that would bring back memories, a simple treat that would remind him of the days when he and his late wife used to bake together. It wasn't about the price or the appearance. It was about the meaning behind the cake. Amanda watched him, her expression stiffening slightly. She didn't understand why someone like him would come into a place like this. His clothes were simple, and his demeanor didn't match the type of customer she was accustomed to. A few of the other customers, who had been observing George's arrival with visible skepticism, began whispering to each other, casting glances toward the elderly man. George's calmness was something they weren't used to. His presence wasn't the type that begged for validation or attention. He was simply there, existing in the moment with an air of dignity that felt out of place in a place that thrived on superficial appearances. After a few moments of silent observation, George's eyes fell upon a modest, round cake sitting at the back of the display. It was simple, nothing flashy, but it held a nostalgic charm. It was a chocolate cake with a subtle swirl of frosting on top, no embellishments or extravagant decorations. He smiled, a small, knowing smile. This was the one. "That one, please," he said, his voice steady and calm. Amanda blinked, taken aback by his choice. She wasn't used to seeing anyone choose such a simple cake in a bakery known for its opulence. But she nodded, putting on her most practiced smile as she lifted the cake and placed it in a box. She still didn't understand what brought him in, but it was just another transaction to her. As she rang up the cake, George reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a checkbook. The other customers, who had been silently judging him, now whispered even more fervently, exchanging glances. One woman in particular, sitting at a nearby table with a small group of friends, leaned in toward her companion and muttered just loudly enough for George to hear. "Probably doesn't even have enough money to pay for it." The comment stung, but George didn't flinch. He wrote out a check, his movements deliberate and practiced, a lifetime of experiences reflected in the way he handled his pen. Amanda glanced at the check, her eyebrows furrowing slightly as she processed the amount written on it. It was far more than the price of the cake. It was enough to buy several cakes, even the most extravagant ones in the shop. Without saying a word, she handed him the box and the receipt. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes lingered on him for just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you, sir," she said in a voice that was barely a whisper, as if something in the air had shifted. The truth beneath the surface. As George slowly walked out of B Bakery, the soft chime of the doorbell signaling his departure, the murmurs inside continued. The wealthy patrons, who had been observing him with curiosity and judgment, went back to their conversations and pastries, but the tension in the air had subtly shifted. Amanda stood behind the counter, a slight frown still playing on her lips as she watched George leave. "Can you believe that?" one of the women at a nearby table remarked, loud enough for everyone to hear, her voice dripping with disbelief. "He must have walked in here by mistake. No one like that ever shops here. Did you see how he was dressed?" "Yeah, I was just about to ask if he needed help, but then he just went straight for the cake case like he belonged." Another woman chimed in, her tone laced with judgment. "I don't know what people are thinking these days." Amanda didn't join the conversation, but her mind lingered on George. He had paid for the cake without hesitation, his check written with an air of quiet authority. But it wasn't just the price that had caught her attention. It was the way he moved through the bakery, the ease with which he navigated the space, as if he was more familiar with it than anyone else there. She hadn't seen many elderly men who carried themselves with such self-assurance, and yet there was something about his presence that made her feel uncertain. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was the deep calm in his eyes, the kind of calm that only comes from a lifetime of experiences, joy, pain, loss, and triumphs that others could never understand. Or maybe it was the way he had brushed off the subtle glares from the other customers, never flinching, never reacting to the looks they cast in his direction. For a moment, Amanda couldn't shake the image of George's face. There was something about his smile, a quiet warmth, like he had seen and been through so much in his life, yet still carried the strength to smile. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen someone her age with such a genuine, unguarded expression. But she didn't have time to dwell on it for long. The bell above the door jingled again as a new customer entered, and she quickly turned her attention to the task at hand, still somewhat shaken by her encounter with George. Meanwhile, George had made his way down the street, the small cake box in his hand, a quiet smile still on his face. He had learned long ago not to let others' opinions of him define who he was. It wasn't his first time being looked down upon, nor would it be his last. In his decades of life, George had encountered more than his fair share of prejudice, discrimination, and cold stares. But those who judged him for his age, his race, or his simple appearance knew nothing of the man he truly was. George wasn't just any man. He was a self-made millionaire who had spent his life building an empire from the ground up. His success had come through hard work, perseverance, and an unshakable belief that anyone, no matter their background, could achieve greatness. His rise to success hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been without its share of struggles. He had faced challenges that would have broken most people, but he had always kept moving forward, always found a way to push through. And yet, despite all of his accomplishments, George had never been one to flaunt his wealth. He didn't drive flashy cars, didn't wear designer suits or shiny jewelry. He didn't need to. His worth wasn't measured by the things he owned, but by the legacy he was building, a legacy of giving back, of helping others rise up, just as he had. George had always believed that success wasn't about personal gain. It was about making a difference in the lives of others. As he walked, the world seemed to move around him at a steady pace. People in Oakwood were busy with their lives, rushing from one appointment to another, sitting in expensive cafes, discussing the latest trends and deals. But George wasn't in a rush. He had nowhere to be but right where he was. He had earned the right to take his time, to savor each moment. Today, he wasn't just buying a cake. Today, he was honoring the memory of his late wife, Lena. She had passed away a few years ago, but her memory was still very much alive in his heart. They had spent many afternoons in the kitchen together, baking simple cakes and cookies, nothing fancy, just treats that they could enjoy together after long days of work. It had been their shared love of baking that had first brought them together many decades ago. As George neared his small apartment, nestled in a quiet corner of the neighborhood, he paused and looked out across the street. The house across from his was being renovated, the construction workers busy with their work, but he wasn't paying attention to the new walls or fresh paint. His eyes were drawn to the small, overgrown garden in the back of the property. He had watched it change over the years, from a beautiful oasis of flowers and plants to a neglected, forgotten space. He had always admired the way Lena had tended to their own garden. She had a green thumb, and her flowers were the talk of the neighborhood. But after her passing, George had stopped caring for the garden. It wasn't the same without her. Still, today, as he stood there in the quiet of the morning, he thought about how Lena would have reacted if she had been here, if she had known about his visit to B Bakery. She would have laughed at his modest choice of cake, and they would have shared it together, enjoying the simple pleasures of life. George took a deep breath and shook his head, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Life had not been easy, but it had been worth living. And today, as he walked inside his apartment, he knew he had made the right choice in buying that cake, not for anyone else, but for himself. Later that afternoon, as George sat at his small kitchen table, the cake box in front of him, he decided that it was time to share the cake. He reached for his phone and dialed a number. The phone rang a few times before someone picked up. "Hello." "Hello, Mary," George said, his voice warm and friendly. "It's George. I'm over here at the apartment. I bought a cake from B Bakery today, and I thought you might want to come over and share it with me." Mary, his longtime friend and neighbor, was a woman in her 60s who had known George for nearly 40 years. She had lived in the apartment next door to his for years, and although they had never been romantically involved, they shared a deep friendship. Mary had always admired George's strength and resilience, just as he admired her ability to find joy in even the most difficult circumstances. "I'd love to, George," Mary responded, her voice cheerful. "I'll be over in 20 minutes. Don't start without me." George smiled and hung up the phone, feeling a wave of warmth fill his heart. Life, he thought, wasn't about the wealth or the accolades that others saw. It was about the people you touched along the way, the small moments of kindness and love that made all the hardships worthwhile. And as he prepared to share the cake with Mary, George couldn't help but think that perhaps this small gesture would be the start of something more than just a quiet afternoon. Maybe it would be a reminder to the people in Oakwood, those who had looked down on him earlier, that appearances could be deceiving. Perhaps they would realize, in time, that there was much more to him than what they had assumed. But for now, George was content to sit with his friend, share a piece of cake, and enjoy the simple pleasure of good company. A moment of reflection. The afternoon was drawing to a close, and the sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the street. The quiet of George's apartment was a welcome contrast to the bustling energy of the bakery earlier that day. Sitting at his kitchen table with Mary, the two of them shared the cake George had carefully selected. It was nothing extravagant, just a simple chocolate cake with a smooth layer of frosting. But to George, it was the perfect way to honor the memory of his wife, Lena. Mary, who had been his neighbor for years, had always been someone who saw past the surface. She never judged George based on his age or his quiet demeanor. In fact, she often admired his ability to remain calm and composed in the face of challenges. She'd known about his success, of course. Everyone in Oakwood did, but she also knew that George was far more than the wealthy businessman the world saw. He was a man who had learned to find joy in the small things, who had weathered the storms of life with grace and dignity. As they sat together, savoring the simple cake, Mary couldn't help but notice the quiet sadness in George's eyes. It wasn't overt, but it was there, in the way he moved his fork slowly through the cake, as if lost in thought. The two of them had spent many quiet afternoons together, talking about everything and nothing. But today, there was something different in the air, a heaviness, perhaps, that George was trying to ignore. "You're thinking about Lena, aren't you?" Mary asked gently, her voice soft, as if she knew exactly what was on his mind. George paused, looking down at the cake in front of him. The small, simple cake was meant to be a celebration, but today it felt like a bittersweet reminder of days long gone. "I miss her, Mary," he said quietly. "Every day, I miss her. But sometimes it feels like she's still here with me, in the little things. This cake, for instance, it reminds me of the times we spent baking together in our kitchen, laughing, talking about everything under the sun." Mary nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I remember the smell of the cinnamon rolls you two used to bake for the neighborhood. People would line up outside your door just to get a taste." A small chuckle escaped George's lips. Lena had a way with food. She believed that food wasn't just about taste. It was about the memories it created. She used to say that every bite should feel like a story, something you could savor and hold on to long after the meal was over. As George spoke, Mary could see the deep love and admiration he had for Lena in every word. He wasn't just talking about his late wife's culinary skills. He was talking about the essence of who she was, a woman who had brought warmth and life to everything around her. For George, the loss of Lena had been like the loss of a part of himself, a part that had once given him strength and purpose. "Do you ever wish she were still here?" Mary asked, her voice filled with the kind of care that only a lifelong friend could offer. George looked out the window, his gaze distant. "Of course I do. There are days when I find myself wishing I could hear her laugh, watch her move around the kitchen, or sit across from her at this table. But then I remember what she taught me. She taught me that life doesn't stop just because someone is gone. She always believed in moving forward, in finding joy in what's left rather than focusing on what's missing. Mary took a deep breath, knowing how deeply George had loved Lena. "You've lived a full life, George. You've built something incredible, and even though she's not here, she'd want you to continue living, to continue sharing your wisdom and kindness with the world." George smiled faintly, his eyes softening as he turned to Mary. "She was always the strong one. I used to joke that she was the glue holding us all together. Without her, it's hard to know how to keep going some days. But you're right. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the past, and maybe it's time I start looking ahead again." The two of them sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the sky was now streaked with shades of pink and orange as the sun set, casting a gentle glow over the neighborhood. George's apartment, though small, had a sense of peace to it, a peace that had taken him years to cultivate. Even after all the hardships he had faced, it was a place of reflection, of quiet solitude, and yet it was also filled with memories of the people he had loved and lost. For George, the journey had been long. He had grown up in a time when the world was not kind to people like him. He had faced discrimination, prejudice, and countless obstacles in his rise to success, but none of that had ever stopped him. From an early age, George had known that he was meant for something greater than what the world expected of him. He had worked tirelessly, pouring his heart and soul into building his business, never letting the harshness of life deter him from his goals. But success had come with its own challenges. While George had built an empire, he had also lost the connections he once held dear. His rise to the top had required sacrifices that, in hindsight, he wished he hadn't made. His marriage to Lena had been a constant anchor for him, but even with her by his side, he had sometimes found himself feeling isolated, disconnected from the very people he had worked so hard to help. And now, years after her death, George was left with the remnants of a life that had once been full of promise and ambition. He had made a name for himself, built an empire from the ground up, and yet, in the quiet of his apartment, with only the memory of Lena to keep him company, George realized that he was still searching for something, a deeper sense of purpose, perhaps, or a way to give back in a way that truly honored his wife's memory. Mary, sensing the shift in George's mood, reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "I know it's hard," she said softly, "but you've got so much left to give, George. You've got the wisdom, the experience, and more than that, you've got the heart to make a difference." George looked at her, his expression softening. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding inside until that moment. Mary was right. There was more to be done. There was more to share. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to start giving back in a way that would honor Lena's legacy, a way that would make a real difference in the lives of others. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall seemed to echo in the quiet room, marking the passage of time. But for the first time in a long while, George felt like he was ready to face whatever came next. He didn't know exactly what that would look like, but he was beginning to understand that it wasn't just about wealth or success anymore. It was about creating a legacy that would outlast him. One built not on material things, but on the lives he touched, the kindness he gave, and the difference he made in the world. As the two of them finished their cake, George's mind wandered to the possibilities. There was still so much he could do, so many lives he could change. It was time to stop living in the past and start living for the future. It was time to take the next step. And perhaps in doing so, he would find that the greatest treasures were not the ones he had accumulated, but the ones he had yet to discover in the hearts of others. The unexpected invitation. The days following George's quiet afternoon with Mary passed in a way that felt almost surreal. The weight of the conversation they had shared lingered in the back of his mind, urging him to reconsider what truly mattered. He had lived much of his life in the shadow of his accomplishments, always striving to build something bigger, something that would define his legacy. But now, with his reflections growing deeper, he realized that the legacy he had been building might not be the one that he truly desired. It was time to shift his focus, to take action, to reach beyond the walls of his quiet apartment, and to find a new purpose. George had always been a man of action, but this time, his course wasn't one that could be measured in wealth or business success. It was about giving back, about rediscovering the community he had distanced himself from over the years. And so, when the phone rang late one evening, its shrill sound breaking the calm of his living room, it was the last thing he expected to hear. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but somehow it had an air of authority. "Mr. George Williams," the voice asked. "This is Rachel Cartwright from Oakwood Community Center. I hope I'm not disturbing you." George had to pause for a moment. He recognized the name of the Oakwood Community Center. It was a local organization that aimed to uplift the neighborhood, to provide resources for families who needed it the most. He knew the center was always looking for donations and volunteers, but he had never been involved personally. He had heard about it, of course, but he wasn't sure if his contributions, financial or otherwise, would make a difference. "No, not at all," George replied, his voice steady. "How can I help you?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Rachel seemed to be gathering her thoughts, and then she spoke with a careful but respectful tone. "Mr. Williams, we've heard a lot about you and your success over the years. I wanted to extend an invitation to you to come visit us at the community center, to meet with our staff and discuss ways we might collaborate on an initiative we're launching this year. Your experience and wisdom would be invaluable in our efforts to bring more resources to the families in Oakwood." George's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting many things that day: calls about business, inquiries about investments, but never this. His instinct was to respond with gratitude, but there was a hesitation in his voice, a part of him unsure whether he was the right person for the job. "I'm not sure what I could bring to the table," George said after a beat. "I'm not exactly a social person, and I'm more accustomed to running a business than working in a community setting." Rachel's voice softened, but there was a sense of optimism behind it. "Mr. Williams, we believe that every person has something valuable to offer, no matter their background. And your story alone, your journey to success, could inspire many in this community. We want to help build a network of support, and we think you could play a key role in that." George sat back in his chair, staring at the phone in his hand. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to reach out to him, especially not someone from a community organization. For so long, he had been living in the shadows of his own success, not realizing that perhaps there was a greater purpose waiting for him. This was the moment, the opportunity he had been seeking, but never knew he needed. After a long pause, George spoke again, his voice steady. "I'll be there," he said, his words firm and decisive. "I'd be happy to meet with you and see how I can help." Rachel's tone brightened instantly, and George could hear the genuine excitement in her voice. "Thank you so much, Mr. Williams. We'll be expecting you. We're excited to have you involved." As the call ended and George put down the phone, he couldn't help but smile. It wasn't a big, flamboyant grin, but a quiet, satisfied smile that reflected a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for a while. For the first time in a long time, George felt like he was on the right path, not the path that had led him to wealth or status, but the path that would connect him to something more meaningful. The next few days passed quickly as George prepared for his visit to the Oakwood Community Center. He didn't need to make any elaborate plans or dress up. He wasn't interested in impressing anyone. He simply wanted to be present, to see for himself how he could contribute. He found himself reflecting more on his past, not in terms of financial accomplishments, but in terms of relationships and the difference he had made, or rather, the difference he had not made, in the lives of those around him. On the day of his visit, George wore the same simple outfit he had worn when he visited the bakery. A worn but well-cared-for white shirt, khaki pants, and comfortable shoes. He didn't want to stand out in any way. This wasn't about his wealth, his success, or his name. This was about lending a hand where it was needed, about showing up, and offering what little he had. As George walked into the community center later that morning, he was greeted warmly by Rachel, who led him to a small conference room where the staff had gathered. He could feel the energy in the room, a palpable sense of hope and determination among the people there. Some of them were volunteers, others were longtime residents of Oakwood, and there was a genuine camaraderie among them all. Rachel introduced George to the group, and he could see the respectful curiosity in their eyes. They had all heard of his success, but none of them seemed overly impressed or starstruck. They were here for a different reason. They wanted to learn from him, but more importantly, they wanted to understand how they could work together to make a lasting impact on the lives of families who needed help the most. Over the next few hours, George listened intently as Rachel and her team outlined their plans for the upcoming year. Initiatives to improve local education, provide job training programs, and create opportunities for young people to succeed. But what struck George the most wasn't just the passion in the room. It was the recognition that perhaps for the first time, he was surrounded by people who were truly making a difference, one small step at a time. They weren't chasing after fame or fortune. They were chasing something far more valuable: community, connection, and a sense of purpose. By the end of the meeting, George was no longer the outsider. He had been welcomed into their fold, not for his wealth or status, but for the wisdom he could share. And as the meeting concluded, Rachel turned to him with a smile. "We'd love for you to be more involved, Mr. Williams," she said. "We think you have so much to offer, and we believe together we can make Oakwood an even better place to live." George left the meeting that day with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt like his life wasn't just about what he could achieve, but about what he could give. The community center, with its dedicated staff and volunteers, had shown him a side of life that he had overlooked for far too long. The power of collective action, the beauty of giving without expectation, and the value of real, tangible change. As he walked home that evening, the sun setting over Oakwood's quiet streets, George realized that this was just the beginning. His journey had taken him down many paths, but now he knew where he was meant to be. There was more to his story than just the pursuit of wealth. It was about making a difference in ways that mattered. It was about finding connection in a world that often seemed too focused on the surface. And with that realization, George made a vow to himself. He would give his time, his wisdom, and his heart to the community of Oakwood, not for recognition or reward, but because he knew that this was the true legacy he wanted to leave behind. The ripple effect. The days following George's first visit to the Oakwood Community Center were filled with a new energy he hadn't felt in years. He was waking up with a purpose that transcended business meetings, financial reports, and the accumulation of wealth. Every day, he spent time at the center, not in the grandiose way one might imagine a wealthy man contributing, but by simply being present, offering advice, and sharing his experiences. He wasn't there to fix everything or to make his mark. He was there to listen, to learn, and to contribute what he could in the most meaningful way possible. Rachel, the director of the center, had quickly taken to George. She saw not just the man who had built a fortune, but the man who carried within him years of wisdom that came from more than just his business successes. It came from his life experiences, his trials and triumphs. Rachel believed that George's involvement could spark something much bigger than a few community initiatives. She saw him as a bridge between the privileged and those who had been overlooked, a way to create change that would ripple through the entire town. One afternoon, as George sat in a small meeting room at the community center, Rachel approached him with a proposal. She had gathered a small group of young entrepreneurs from Oakwood, people who had great ideas but were struggling to get their businesses off the ground. Many of them were from disadvantaged backgrounds, and they lacked the resources, mentorship, and networks needed to succeed. "We've been talking about how to make a bigger impact in Oakwood," Rachel said, her voice filled with excitement. "And we think you could help. You've built something remarkable, George. Your journey, your experience, it's exactly what these young people need to hear." I'd like to invite you to speak at a mentorship program we're starting." George leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the wooden table. The thought of being in front of a group of people, especially young ones looking to him for guidance, made him uneasy. He had always been a private person, someone who preferred working quietly behind the scenes, letting his actions speak for themselves. But Rachel's enthusiasm was contagious, and he couldn't deny the pull of her request. He knew that this was another step in the journey he had begun, one that could change not just his own life, but the lives of those around him. "I'm not much of a speaker," George said, his voice humble, "but I'll give it a try. I'd be happy to help where I can." Rachel's face lit up with gratitude. "You don't have to give a grand speech, George. Just share your story. That's all they need. They need to hear how you went from nothing to building a business, how you overcame obstacles. It'll inspire them more than you can imagine." The following week, George arrived at the community center early, his nerves buzzing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He had never stood in front of a crowd of aspiring entrepreneurs before. He was used to boardrooms, business meetings, and speaking with people who shared his professional background. This was different. These were young people from all walks of life, many of whom had faced challenges far beyond anything George had encountered in his rise to success. As he entered the room, he was greeted with warm smiles and eager faces. The group was small, no more than a dozen, but there was an undeniable sense of hope in the air. These young people were determined to make something of themselves, and they were looking to George for inspiration. He started slowly, speaking from the heart. "When I was your age, I didn't know how to get from where I was to where I wanted to be. I didn't have a mentor to show me the way, and I didn't have money or connections. All I had was a desire to create something that mattered. I didn't know if I would succeed, but I knew I had to try. And when I look back, the most important thing I can tell you is this: don't let the obstacles you face define you. Let them refine you." The room fell silent as George continued, sharing stories of his early struggles, his failures, and the lessons he had learned along the way. He spoke not of wealth or fame, but of resilience, the kind of resilience that comes from facing adversity and still choosing to move forward. He told them about the nights when he had doubted himself, the moments when he thought of giving up, and the people who had helped him along the way. "I didn't make it on my own," he said, looking around at the young faces in the room. "There were people who believed in me, who supported me when I couldn't see the way forward. And that's why I'm here now, to offer you the same support, to help you see that your dreams are possible, no matter where you start." As George spoke, he could see the shift in the room. The young entrepreneurs were leaning forward, their eyes focused on him with a new sense of possibility. For many of them, this was the first time someone had told them that they mattered, that their dreams were worth pursuing. And for George, it was the first time he truly felt like he was making the difference he had always wanted to make, not through his wealth, but through his words, his actions, and his willingness to show up. After the session ended, several of the young entrepreneurs approached George, eager to speak with him one-on-one. They asked him questions about his journey, seeking advice on everything from building a business to overcoming self-doubt. For George, these conversations were the most fulfilling part of the entire experience. He realized that by sharing his story, he was offering more than just knowledge. He was offering hope. He was showing them that success wasn't just for the chosen few, but for anyone who was willing to put in the work and stay true to their vision. Over the next few months, George continued to visit the community center, mentoring the young entrepreneurs and offering his guidance whenever he could. The ripple effect of his involvement began to spread through Oakwood as more and more people, both young and old, were inspired by his willingness to give back. The mentorship program grew, attracting more participants, and George's story became a beacon of hope for those who had long been overlooked by society. But it wasn't just the community center that began to change. George himself began to see the world differently. He had spent so many years focused on personal achievement and success that he had lost sight of the things that truly mattered. The relationships, the connections, and the impact he could make by simply helping others. It was at a small dinner party a few weeks later, hosted by Rachel to celebrate the success of the mentorship program, that George realized just how much his life had shifted. As he sat among the diverse group of people, young entrepreneurs, community leaders, and volunteers, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment that he hadn't experienced in years. There was no fanfare, no flashy displays of wealth or status. Instead, there was a quiet pride in the room, a sense of collective accomplishment that didn't come from personal gain, but from the shared efforts of a community working together to uplift one another. George raised his glass in a quiet toast, not to his success, but to the community that had embraced him, and to the young people whose lives he had touched in ways he could never have imagined. This, George said, his voice filled with gratitude, is what success looks like. And in that moment, he understood that the greatest legacy he could leave behind was not the fortune he had amassed, but the lives he had touched and the change he had helped create. The ripple effect had begun, and it was only just getting started. The legacy of giving back. As the seasons passed, George's connection to the Oakwood Community Center and the people he had met there only deepened. What had begun as a simple invitation had blossomed into a lifelong commitment. The young entrepreneurs he had mentored were thriving, finding new opportunities, expanding their businesses, and spreading the same sense of hope and determination that George had shared with them. He became more than just a mentor. He became a guiding force in the community, a symbol of resilience and the power of giving back. But George's impact wasn't just about business success or financial gains. It was about the intangible qualities that formed the backbone of Oakwood's transformation: trust, unity, and the idea that no one was ever truly alone. Over the course of a year, George had come to realize that the strength of a community wasn't measured by its wealth, but by its ability to support one another, to lift each other up when life got difficult, and to create a space where everyone could grow, regardless of their past. One crisp autumn morning, as George walked through the doors of the community center for a meeting, Rachel greeted him with a look of excitement on her face. "George, we've been planning something special for the upcoming holiday season, and I wanted to run it by you. We've been thinking about creating a community-wide event to bring everyone together, to celebrate the progress we've made, and to raise awareness about some of the ongoing needs in Oakwood. But we need someone to speak at the event, and I can't think of anyone better than you." George raised an eyebrow. "A community-wide event? What are we talking about here?" Rachel smiled, clearly energized by the idea. "We want to host a celebration, a way to honor everyone who has contributed to the changes we've seen. It'll be a night of music, food, storytelling, and honoring the people who have made a difference. And of course, we want to spotlight the businesses and individuals who have benefited from the mentorship program." George was quiet for a moment, considering her words. This wasn't just another opportunity to share his story. It was a chance to shine a light on the collective effort that had transformed the community. It was a chance to show everyone that success wasn't about individual glory, but about the power of working together for the greater good. "I think it's a great idea," George said finally, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has worked together to make this happen. The businesses, the volunteers, the families, everyone who has helped build Oakwood into a place where people can succeed, regardless of their background." Rachel nodded, clearly appreciating George's perspective. "Exactly. You've been such an important part of this, George. Your story has inspired so many, but I want this event to celebrate the community as a whole. It's a chance for everyone to see what we can achieve when we work together." That night, as George stood in front of a packed room at the Oakwood Community Center, he felt a wave of pride and gratitude wash over him. The room was filled with people from all walks of life. Families who had been through struggles, young entrepreneurs who had found success, volunteers who had poured their hearts into the community, and elders who had watched as Oakwood slowly but surely transformed into a place of opportunity. George took the stage, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at ease in front of a crowd. The room was filled with energy, the hum of conversation and laughter in the air. He could hear the music playing softly in the background, and the smell of homemade dishes wafting from the nearby tables. It was a celebration of all that Oakwood had become, a place of hope, resilience, and unity. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the room as he began to speak. It's hard to believe that just a year ago, I walked into this community center unsure of what I could contribute. But what I found here, what I saw in each and every one of you, was something incredible. I saw people who had faced hardships, people who had been told their dreams were out of reach, and yet you stood tall. You believed in yourselves. You believed in each other. He paused, looking out at the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. I've been fortunate in my life to achieve many things, but none of that matters without the relationships we build along the way. This community has shown me that true success isn't about money or status. It's about lifting each other up, about creating a space where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. And that's exactly what we've done here. We've built something together, something that's far more valuable than anything I could have ever imagined. The room was silent, everyone listening intently to his words. George's voice was steady, but his heart was full. I've spent a lifetime accumulating things, but I've learned that the real treasure isn't what you collect. It's the lives you touch. It's the impact you make on the people around you. And I've seen that impact in every one of you. You've shown me that the greatest success is not measured in dollars, but in the difference we make in the lives of others. A ripple of applause swept through the room, and George smiled softly, the warmth of the moment filling him with a sense of fulfillment that was deeper than any business deal or financial achievement he had ever experienced. Thank you for letting me be a part of this journey, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for showing me what true success looks like, and thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to make a difference. As he finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause, their appreciation clear in every clap and cheer. But George didn't feel like the star of the evening. Instead, he felt like a small part of something much bigger, a community that had come together to create a better future for everyone. The night continued with laughter, music, and food, as George mingled with the people who had become his new family. He talked with young entrepreneurs who had turned their dreams into reality, with families who were now thriving thanks to the resources they had received, and with volunteers who had dedicated their time to making Oakwood a better place. Everywhere he looked, he saw the fruit of his labor, not in the form of financial gain, but in the form of lives transformed, opportunities created, and futures rewritten. As the evening drew to a close, George stepped outside into the cool night air, taking a deep breath as he looked up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He had spent his life building wealth and success, but it was only now that he truly understood what mattered. In the end, it wasn't about what he had acquired, but about the legacy he left behind. And as he thought about all the lives he had touched, through his mentorship, his presence, and his story, he knew that his true success lay not in what he had built, but in what he had given. And that, George realized, was the most fulfilling legacy he could ever hope to leave.